Okay, this is the lesson I promised, lesson 2 on arguments from analogy. And in this lesson, we'll go through briefly how to critically evaluate an argument from analogy. So that's our topic for today, evaluating arguments from analogy. In the last lesson, we talked about the general structure of an argument from analogy, its elements, and how they relate. We noted that there are two things that we're relating in an analogy. We call those the analogs. One will serve as the conclusion analog. The other will serve as the premise analog. And then there is the attribute of interest, or the thing that we are saying is the same between the two. And so that's where we're at. Now we want to know how to critically evaluate or how to think about arguments from analogy, how to assess whether an argument from analogy is good or not. So let's go back to the example we used several times last time and see what we get here. Nothing bad happened when we left Vietnam, therefore nothing bad will happen if we leave Iraq. Now, some of you might have heard this, particularly if you're a history buff and know anything about what happened when we left Vietnam, and you might contend that that there's something wrong with that argument, and you're, I think, absolutely correct. There is. But here's the question that we want to ask ourselves. How much support, remember, support, not prove, not demonstrate, but support, how likely does this argument make the conclusion to be true? Or how much support does this offer for thinking that nothing bad will happen if we leave Iraq? Well, to evaluate that, we have to ask how similar the two terms of the analogy are, right? Now, what are our two terms of the analogy, or what are our two analogs here? The analogs here, or what we might also call the terms of the analogy, are Vietnam and Iraq. And the first thing to critically evaluate, and really one of the main things to critically evaluate in an argument from analogy, is how alike the two things being compared really are. How comparable is the Vietnam War to the Iraq War? And if you are a history buff or you know anything about our departing from the Vietnam War, one of the things that you might have thought was, well, wait a minute, those are two fundamentally different sorts of wars. Then what you're saying is that because they're different, a truth of one, the Vietnam War, doesn't necessarily imply a truth about the other. But the point here is that our first step is to focus on the question, how similar are these two terms, these two analogs, okay? In this case, it seems as though, and in fact, they are very, very different. The war in Iraq and the war in Vietnam were fought for entirely different reasons among entirely different groups of people who were motivated by entirely different sorts of motives. There were different levels of social and political engagement. How we engaged in the war between the two was really fundamentally different. These two are not entirely the same. Now, it is true, some things will be the same, but not a whole lot. There's quite a bit that will be different, I should say. Because of that, really, the idea that nothing bad happened when we left Vietnam really only provides modest support for the idea that nothing bad will happen when we leave Iraq. That is, because they're dissimilar, finding a truth in one doesn't necessarily mean, doesn't likely mean that it will be a truth in the other. It only offers modest support, maybe a 50-50 chance or so, right? And because of that, what we need is a modest confidence level indicator. We need to say something more like this. Here's the original formulation. Nothing bad happened when we left Vietnam, therefore nothing bad will happen if we leave Iraq. Because the two are somewhat dissimilar, what we really should be saying is something like this: nothing bad happened when we left Vietnam, so it's possible nothing bad will happen if we leave Iraq. Notice what we've done here is we've backed off on how confident we are in our conclusion. Why? Well, because we're acknowledging that there are important differences between Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, and the war in Iraq, and that our conclusion is certainly not super strong. It's not super strong. We'll just go with that word. That sounds like a great word, super strong. All right? So here's the point now. This is my, boom, there it is. A very good critical thinking habit is when you're looking at an argument from analogy, zero in like radar on the analogy and look for differences. That's how to critically think about them. And the other thing to critically evaluate is how confident the person seems to be in their conclusion. If they're super, super confident in their conclusion that it's, there's almost no way that this could be false, then the two need to be really, 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 really similar, like identical twins kind of similar, right? But if the two things that they're comparing are not really super alike, if you're comparing high school football and the NFL, right? Well, okay, they're playing the same game, but there are really a lot of differences between them and what the players are capable of and the distribution of talent among the league and these sorts of things, that you should probably be fairly modest in your confidence level speaking when comparing the two, because they're not entirely similar, all right? Let's try a few for examples. Here are a couple arguments from analogy, and we'll zero in like radar on the analogy, right? So here's the first one. Bobo, by the way, I don't know who names someone Bobo. Probably I'm thinking this is a monkey or some sort of a pet, like a dog or a cat or a bird. I made a bird. I don't know any dog that would be named Bobo. A bird, potentially. A monkey, quite plausibly. I'm not thinking a dog. Maybe a cat, if you didn't like your cat. But in my opinion, there's nothing to like about cats anyway. But I digress. Bobo likes steak, so he's sure to like carrots. By the way, Bobo's a he, in case we were wondering. Yeah, is this a good analogy? No, it's really not a good analogy. Why? Well, because steak and carrots are totally dissimilar, right? They don't taste the same. They're fundamentally different kinds of nutrition. One is essentially animal flesh, right? And the other is, a vegetable that grows in the ground. So these are fundamentally different sorts of foods, right? So really, this argument offers pretty much zero support for thinking Bobo is going to like carrots, right? There's very little support. Remember, the degree of support can be echoed in how confident we are in our conclusion. So don't worry in this case about how confident they are about their conclusion. Just throw this argument out because the two are totally dissimilar. All right? Let's try another one. That guy will make an awful dog owner. Just look at how he treats his kids. Ah, very good. So now what are the terms, or what are the analogs in this argument? Now remember, the analogs are particulars, and the particulars can be things, but they can also be events and other sorts of things. So in this case, what are the two things that we're comparing? Well, it seems obvious that we're comparing how this person treats their kids and how they will treat a dog. And they're basically saying that this guy's not going to treat a dog very well because he doesn't treat his kids very well, okay? Now, is this a good analogy? That is, are the two terms similar? Well, there's a lot more reason for thinking that how someone treats their kids will reflect how they'll treat an animal. In other words, if someone will abuse their kids, it's pretty reasonable to think that they would be abusive to an animal. Now, not necessarily. Some people just get really impatient with their kids in a way that they don't get impatient with a dog. I don't know why that is, but it is the case in some cases. So it's not a perfect analogy, but notice this is a lot better than steaks and carrots, right? There is some reason to think that the two are similar. So this argument, we would say, generally is good because children and dogs both experience pain. They both experience unhappiness. And your treatment of either reflects this, right? There's certain things we don't do to our children because we know they experience pain. Likewise, there's certain things we don't do to an animal because we know that it experiences pain. And so our motive for treatment in each case seems to be the same. So the two are generally the same. Our treatment would be about the same. There's an additional point here that generally people are more careful about how they treat their children than how they treat their animals. Now, some would argue that's not necessarily the case, but I would argue back. I don't leave my 10-year-old home alone for more than maybe 20 minutes while I run a quick errand. Why? I'm concerned about somebody breaking into the house and him being harmed. I leave my dog home alone inside the house for 8 hours at a time if I have to. Um, Not really worried about somebody breaking into the house and harming him. Actually, he's pretty good about hiding. And actually, to be honest with you, my dog would probably just pee all over their feet. So that would serve them right. But notice that there is a difference between the two. But if we'll treat our children carefully, there's a good chance we'll treat the dog carefully. And if we'll treat a dog carefully, there's a good chance we'll treat our children carefully. Okay. So this argument offers reasonable support for thinking that this person would not make a good dog owner, right? Okay, now some of you are probably reading this going, hey, wait a minute, this is pretty subjective, isn't it? I mean, isn't there a lot of room for disagreement? The answer is yes, of course, right? People will disagree in the sense that there will be counterexamples to this. There will be people who have dogs who treat them really poorly, who wouldn't imagine harming their children in that same way. And there are people who have children who treat them poorly, maybe are verbally abusive in a way that they're not to their dogs. Or maybe even they're neglectful of their children in a way they're not neglectful of their dog. Yeah, is there going to be disagreement? Absolutely, sure. Like I said, remember, we're not doing deductive arguments, we're doing inductive arguments. And the point of these kinds of arguments is not that our premises prove our conclusion, but that they make it likely. They make it reasonable to believe, with exceptions plausible, okay? And that is certainly what we just did. It was a better analogy than the analogy between our liking of steak and our liking of carrots, okay? Let's try another one. When Abraham Lincoln became president, Lincoln had less political experience than Obama, and Lincoln was a great president. So it's certainly possible that Obama could be an above-average president despite lacking experience. This example is a bit dated. President Obama, the question on whether you think he's a good or a bad president has probably been settled by now. He's about to leave office as I record this. But now notice here, question, what are the two terms of the analogy, or what are our two analogs? We're comparing President Obama and former President Lincoln, soon to be former President Obama and former President Lincoln. And what we're trying to figure out here is whether President Obama will be an above average president. And the answer is yes. And why? Well, because President Lincoln was great and he had little experience. So the two things that we are comparing, the terms, are how each will do as president, or Obama and Lincoln. I want you to note here the below average confidence level here. Notice that they're saying, so it's certainly possible that Obama could be an above average president. They're being very modest in their confidence level, okay? They think that it's reasonable to conclude, but they understand that there could be some important differences between the two, because there could be more that goes into being an above average president than just the amount of experience you have. But they are similar enough that there is some reason to believe. That's why they've lowered their confidence level. Note also that it would be really hard to dispute such a modest confidence level, that it would be really hard to say, um, you know, that's not true that he could be. It's not true that he could be an awesome president or an above average president. Notice they've lowered the bar there too, right? He doesn't have to be great like President Lincoln was. He just has to be above average. That's what their conclusion is. So just notice that when we lower our confidence level in these things, they become much harder to refute. Okay. All right, let's try another one. She's terrible at tennis, so I doubt she'll be great at racquetball. What are the two analogs or the two terms here? Well, it's this girl's ability to play tennis and her ability to play racquetball. What's our confidence level? Notice they're saying, I doubt that she'll be great. Now, when we doubt something, we're saying it's certainly possible. We're not saying it's certain. We're not saying it's likely. So, how strong is this argument? Well, or how good is this argument? The analogy isn't perfect, right? So tennis and racquetball are pretty close, but there are some important and subtle differences, right? In tennis, you have a net you have to get the ball over. In racquetball, you just have to hit the damn wall. In tennis, you're playing against a partner who's across from you. The ball is different, the size of the court is different, and your racket is different than in racquetball. So there are important differences between the two, but also notice they're pretty modest in their confidence level about whether this argument is strong. They're saying that they doubt she'd be a great racquetball player. They're not saying it's certain she wouldn't. And because of that, this actually becomes, it's not a perfect analogy, but because the confidence level is pretty modest, this would be a tough argument to defeat, okay? That this is a pretty strong argument, all right? Let's do another one. Warren takes good care of his personal appearance. Let's ask him to house sit for us while we're in Europe. Very good. Now, what are the terms of the analogy, or what are the analogs here? What are the premise and the conclusion analogs here? Well, the thing that we are interested in concluding is that Warren will take good care of our house for us while we're in Europe. That's our conclusion analog. What are we comparing to know that that's the case? What's our premise analog? Well, he takes really good care of his personal appearance. His beard is like groomed to no end, very sharply defined, extra facial hairs straying here and there, and his hair is always combed and brushed, and he always smells like eucalyptus from his body wash or whatever. I don't know. I'm making a lot of this stuff up. But the two things that we're comparing is Warren's personal care of himself and his ability to care for a house. Okay. So then, what confidence level do we have here? That unfortunately is overlapping with my other notes. There's a placement error. What's our confidence level? How confident are they in that? Now, they don't make that explicit. They don't say, so it's likely, so it's possible, so it's probable. They don't express it here. But you can get a sense of how confident they are in the analogy if they are willing to give this person control of their house while they are in Europe. So the speaker is willing to put money on this. Odds are they're pretty confident in that result. So is this a good argument? It would seem to be a poor argument because it's a lot easier to wash your face than it is to keep a house clean, okay, and to protect a house. So there's a lot more that goes into that. Let's try another one. Lysol kills germs, so it might make a great deodorant. Two terms of the analogy, or the analogs. The conclusion analog is whether Lysol, or that Lysol will make a great deodorant. Why do we think that? What's the analog for the premise? Well, it's Lysol's ability to kill germs. So they're saying that its ability to kill germs is a reason to think that it would that it's able to function as a deodorant, right? Okay, so there's our two terms of the analogy. How confident are they? They are modestly confident, right? It might make a relatively, it might make a great deodorant. This is a relatively cautious thing. Now, is this a good argument? In spite of the fact that they are relatively cautious in their degree of confidence, This is not a good argument. Why? Because your ability to kill germs and your ability to function as a deodorant are entirely different. And Lysol actually says on the can, not intended for personal hygiene. A deodorant can doesn't say that. So the two terms of the analogy, or the analogs, the premise and conclusion analog, are not similar enough here for this argument to work well, even though it has a confidence indicator that's relatively cautious. Okay. All right, next one. Babcock is a great senator. She might make a good president. What are the two terms of the analogy? It's B's performance as a senator and B's performance as president. They want us to believe, or they believe, that B will make a good president. Why? Because she's made a good senator. Actually, not a good senator, a great senator. So notice we went from great to good. And what is the confidence level here? Well, the confidence level is that she might well be a good president. So they're fairly modestly confident. Is this a good argument? Again, the answer is going to be yes, because the analogy is reasonable from senator to president, and they've got a relatively modest confidence level. Okay. Let's try another one. Hey, the ice caps on Mars are melting, and that isn't due to fossil fuel emissions. So melting ice caps here aren't due to fossil fuel emissions either. Now, someone here is comparing the melting of ice caps on Mars and on Earth. Yes, Mars has ice caps, just like the Earth does. And we're comparing the two. And what we're saying is that what's supposed to be the same between them is that the melting ice caps on Mars are clearly not due to fossil fuel emissions, right? Unless Marvin the Martian has developed some sort of vehicle that we have not detected yet that has a great deal of auto emissions, or I should say fossil fuel emissions, in which case you would have to wonder where he got the fossil fuels from. I'm not clear that there were ever dinosaurs on Mars, but maybe there's a lot about Mars we don't know, and I'm digressing. But their contention here is that, hey, look, the polar ice caps are melting on Mars, not due to fossil fuels. They're melting here, so it's also not due to fossil fuel emissions. Is this a good argument? Well, Mars and Earth are actually physically similar, and that's a good reason to think the ice caps could melt on Earth in the absence of fossil fuel emissions, right? On the other hand, it does seem a doubtful reason for thinking fossil fuel emissions aren't a cause of melting here. Now, let's talk about this point, actually, sorry, before I move forward. It could very well be that the ice caps are melting on Mars and on Earth, and that on Mars it's not due to fossil fuels. That's not to say that fossil fuels here, and it's quite possible that on Earth they're melting, for whatever reason, they're melting on Mars as well. But if that's true, that doesn't also rule out the contribution of fossil fuel emissions. In other words, fossil fuel emissions could also be a contributing factor to that here on Earth. Okay? All right. Arguments from analogy are especially important in four subjects. There are four areas where we use arguments from analogy all the time. In the law, they're used all the time. They refer to it sometimes as legal precedent. In moral philosophy, if you have my ethics course, we go through arguments from analogy quite a bit. When we study history, we use arguments from analogy a lot. The past and the future, and this was like that, and this, the War of 1812 was very much like the War of 1918 in this way. The War of 1918 is World War I. In these ways, yada, 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 okay? And medical experiments use arguments from analogy all the time, right? We test some things in chimpanzees, and we argue that because it works well in chimpanzees, it will work well in us humans, or vice versa. So in medical experiments all the time. Here's one from history. The only way to learn anything from history is to see similarities between the past events and current events. So we're always looking for similarities there. When it comes to the law, there's a principle of legal decisions called stare decisis, and what that means is that the decision that's been made in a prior court case, if it's like the one that is before a judge now, must be ruled in a similar manner, unless there is some egregious or important difference between the two cases. If two cases are essentially the same and the one before a judge now is fundamentally like one that has been before a judge in the past, then that judge must rule consistent with the findings in that prior case. Okay? All right. They also refer to this as appeal to precedent. Okay. Kind of already made these points. I'm going to move forward. Fundamental principle in ethics is that similar cases are to be treated similarly. So it would be wrong to allow a member of a women's basketball team to make up a test and not allow members of the men's basketball team to do that. Why? Well, because everybody should be treated similar. There's no fundamental difference between men and women when it comes to their ability to take tests or their opportunity to take tests. And because there's no relevant difference, they need to be treated the same. Well, that is used in ethics to prove different things. And the important thing here is that there's no relevant difference between the two cases. The last one here is medical experiments that involve lab animals. Whether the results apply to humans depends on the strength of the analogy between the lab animals and the human being. So there are certain animals that have human-like organs, others have human-like skin, others have human-like reflexes. So we do experiments believing in or from the idea that these two things are fundamentally similar. Here's just an interesting little tidbit for you. Recently, the New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled that a woman's having a lesbian affair does not constitute adultery. Now, this is going to be a legal issue, but it refers back to an argument from analogy in the counter argument. And here's the counter argument. By the way, the reason this was so is because adultery was defined in New Hampshire as an affair was a relationship between a man and a woman who are not married. Well, then if your relationship is not with, if you're a woman and your relationship is not with a man, but it's with another woman, then by definition you have not committed adultery. Well, there was a counter argument to this, right? And so when they divorced, I believe that the husband sued and was told, well, you can't sue because by definition she didn't commit adultery. And so there was a suit about that, and the counter argument that they made was this, that an extramarital sexual relationship, doesn't matter whether it was heterosexual or homosexual, is the exact same thing in that they're both betrayals. So what they've done here is they said, wait a minute, here's the two analogs, heterosexual adultery and homosexual adultery, right? These are the two analogs. And the thing that is the same is that they are both betrayal. That is the term of the analogy, the thing being compared that is the same, the analog. I am so confusing my language right now. The thing that is the same between the two is that they're both betrayals. So they're using an argument from analogy saying, hey, look, there's no, in heterosexual relationships, what's wrong about it is that it's a betrayal. And that's the exact same thing that's happening in a homosexual relationship. So if it's illegal in a heterosexual relationship, it should also be illegal in a homosexual relationship. And in fact, I believe the law was changed in light of that. So, but notice how they were able to use an argument from analogy in that. All right, determining whether two situations are analogous can be so important we leave it to the courts to decide. While analogical reasoning can have a subjective components, it's undeniably important and requires careful deliberation. So there you go. That's how to critically evaluate an argument from analogy. All right.